Welcome to Sherlock Tales, where every mystery comes alive. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, give this video a like, and share it with your fellow mystery lovers. Tell us in the comments, which part of the world are you watching from? Let's solve mysteries together.
It was upon a grey and sullen morning in early November that I found myself once again seated across from my old friend Sherlock Holmes, the hearth at Baker Street, flaring to life with little conviction against the damp cold that had seeped into every brick of the city. London wore its usual garb of mist and gloom, and though the gaslights burned pale through the fog, the streets outside our windows held the hush of something waiting to happen. Holmes, as ever, appeared both wholly present and wholly remote, sprawled on the settee in his saffron dressing gown, eyes half-lidded, yet fingers twitching with a nervous anticipation that only ever meant one thing. A case was stirring, though its form had yet to resolve. I was about to remark on the silence when Mrs. Hudson entered, a pale blue envelope held delicately in her hand. "This just came by special post, Mr. Holmes," she said, glancing toward me with a subtle nod before placing it on the table and retreating. Holmes sat up at once. From the west, if I'm not mistaken. Note the dampness at the corner, early morning dew and the faint scent of yew and chalk. Watson, would you care to wager this was penned no more than 50 yards from a monastery or burial chapel? I opened my mouth, as ever astonished at how quickly Holmes could summon such improbable details from thin air. But he had already torn open the envelope. The paper inside was thick and brittle with age, not the kind one buys at Charing Cross, and the ink was brown, bordering on rust. Holmes scanned it quickly, his brows knitting together. "Well now," he murmured, "this is unusual." I leaned forward. "What is it?" Rather than answering, Holmes handed me the letter. "Sir, I write not for publicity nor reward, but because I fear I am hearing a ghost. For the past 3 nights a voice, clear and unmistakable, has spoken from within the old Abbey wall. Not moaning or weeping, but a voice whispering my name. No one else hears it, not my wife, nor the gardener, nor the vicar. But I have walked the grounds alone each night, and each night it returns. The voice is that of my brother James, dead these 16 years. Come if you wish. I do not know whether to fear madness or murder. Yours in haste, Elliot Godfrey Abbott's Grange near Lichfield Holmes had already risen and was lighting a fresh pipe, the very act a declaration of war against boredom. His lean figure stood framed against the window like some tall bird of prey, waiting for the wind to shift. Elliot Godfrey, he repeated. A name with roots. Retired solicitor, if I recall correctly. Modest inheritance from a childless uncle. Known to be reclusive, not one to write foolish letters. You think this is serious? I think, said Holmes, that a man hearing his dead brother's voice from a stone wall is either mad or being made to think himself so, and I have never found madness nearly as curious as its imitation. He glanced toward the fire, where the letter was now curled in the grate. Pack for 2 nights, Watson. Abbott's Grange has the scent of something old, something hidden. We may find a ghost, or perhaps something worse. Within an hour, we were rattling north by rail through the Midlands mist. I could not have known then that the voice behind the wall would lead us into a labyrinth of forgotten sins, silent rooms, and a secret that had waited 16 years to be heard. Our arrival at Lichfield was met by a hush more profound than any we had left behind in London. The countryside was cloaked in a colourless quiet, the sort of subdued stillness that gathers around places grown too old to remember change. A carriage awaited us at the station, black, serviceable, drawn by a single grey horse that seemed almost too elegant for the modest nature of the town. The driver, a hollow-eyed fellow in a short-brimmed cap, gave Holmes a quick, unreadable glance and said nothing until we were well beyond the city. Abbott's Grange, he finally muttered, as though naming the place were an ill omen. Roads poor. Mist worse. Holmes gave only a brief nod, eyes fixed on the hedgerows flashing past. He was watching the land itself now, the sloping fields, the hawthorn, the ancient walls half buried in lichen, committing it all to memory with that strange and silent diligence of his. I had long learned not to interrupt him in such moments. It was in these early observations, I knew, that the seeds of deduction were planted. We reached the estate just past midday. Abbott's Grange was a great brooding structure of moss-darkened stone, its central wing flanked by 2 lower outbuildings and set against the backdrop of a distant yew forest. An old chapel, or what remained of one, stood detached from the main house, its crumbling bell tower half swallowed by ivy. The wall in question, I surmised, must have belonged to that ruined structure. Indeed, there was a heaviness to the air about it, not of superstition, but of something that once bore witness and had not forgotten. Elliot Godfrey awaited us at the front steps. He was a tall man, stooped with the curvature of age and some deep inner weight. His clothes were impeccably tailored, but looked as though they hadn't been worn in some time. His cuffs faintly dusty, his collar a half-inch askew. His face bore the refined, slightly washed-out dignity of a man who had once dealt in exactitudes, contracts, codes, perhaps the long grammar of inheritance. "I must thank you for coming," he said at once, though his voice held no gratitude. "It was either you, Mr. Holmes, or the local physician, and I fear I would have preferred a diagnosis of madness from a man of science than silence from a man of law." Holmes stepped forward and offered his hand. "I take it the voice spoke again last night." Godfrey's fingers tightened briefly. "Yes, just once, same time, just after 2 in the morning. And you are still the only one who hears it?" "I am." We were shown inside. The house was dim but not unkempt. Books lined the walls, and a Persian carpet stretched across a floor that had seen generations of footsteps. A grandfather clock ticked rhythmically in the drawing room, and somewhere a coal scuttle was being filled with measured care. It was not the home of a madman, nor one in disarray, and yet the stillness of it had a taste. Godfrey poured a single measure of brandy into a glass and drank without offering us any. "It comes from the west wall of the chapel," he said. "I live alone with my wife and the help, a man and his boy who manage the garden and firewood. We've never heard anything like it before. And I haven't told them the nature of it, only that there's been some disturbance." Holmes turned slightly. "You mentioned in your letter that the voice called your name." Godfrey nodded. "My full name. 3 syllables clear. Elliot." Then the pause, then Godfrey. Not a whisper, not a moan. "A calling. No emotion, no menace, just identity." "And you are certain it is your brother's voice?" "I would stake my life on it." "We were twins," that gave Holmes pause. He blinked once, slow, then resumed pacing. "Your brother passed 16 years ago. Circumstances? A fall at the Grange. In fact, near that very wall. He was climbing one of the inner buttresses. Why, I do not know. He had a touch of the theatrical in him. He lost his footing. We buried him here in the chapel graveyard, just 6 paces from the wall where I now hear him speak." Holmes turned to me. "You hear that, Watson? The brother dies by a wall, and now the wall speaks. There's a kind of cruel poetry to it." We requested a tour of the grounds. Godfrey led us through the back of the house, across a mossy stone path flanked by overgrown hedges, until we stood before the chapel. Its roof had partially collapsed, and only one stained glass window remained intact, though dirt and time had rendered its colors into vague patches of red and blue. The west wall stood at the edge of the graveyard, thick and ancient, with hairline cracks spidering through its lower half. There were no openings, no door, no obvious floor. Holmes placed both hands on the stone. He bent, pressed his ear to it, then stood and took 3 steps back. His eyes scanned upward, slowly, deliberately, before resting on a portion near the top where the stone had slightly shifted inward. "The voice comes from here." Godfrey pointed. "Exactly there, just below that niche, as though the wall itself is remembering." Holmes turned to me with the faintest hint of excitement. "Watson, do you see it?" I followed his gaze, but the wall to me was still a wall. Ancient, yes. Weathered, certainly, but otherwise unremarkable. Look closely. The mortar seam between those 2 upper stones, not worn, replaced. A newer bond. And lower there's a small vine, Virginia creeper, which only takes to damp stone. Yet that patch is dry. He stepped closer, then knelt at the base of the wall, examining the grave markers nearby. One, weather-worn and leaning, bore the inscription, "James Godfrey, 1851-1875. He spoke often of truth." Holmes stared at it a moment longer, then traced his finger along the edge of the grave. "I would like to examine the chapel's interior this evening," he said quietly, "and I would ask that you take no action, and none at all, until I give the word. Watson, we shall take rooms here tonight." Godfrey hesitated. "You will hear it too, perhaps." Holmes didn't reply immediately. Then, "I don't believe I need to. That night, after a late supper taken in silence, we sat in the chapel with our lanterns dimmed, listening. Midnight passed and then 1 o'clock. The wind scraped gently at the windowless arch above us, and the leaves whispered in a tone that made even my doctor's mind flirt with superstition. Then, at precisely 2 o'clock, something stirred, a sound, faint but distinct, not from behind the wall but within it. A movement, a shift, a sigh. It did not speak, but it moved. Holmes stiffened. "Watson," he whispered, "fetch me a candle, and bring the pocket lens." I obeyed. He stepped to the base of the wall and placed the flame close to the dry vine he had noted earlier. The stone warmed. The vine curled. And then, impossibly, a small panel in the wall clicked. A seam opened. Holmes turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Well," he said, "either the dead have learned carpentry, or someone very living has something to hide." The wall, it seemed, had not been speaking at all. It had been listening, and someone, somewhere nearby, had wanted Elliot Godfrey to hear. Holmes held the candle steady, its flame quivering against the cold draught that had begun to seep from the narrow opening. The wall's hidden panel, no larger than a letterbox, had revealed a hollow space behind the stone, dark, dry, and improbably deep. I crouched beside him, trying to peer in, but the angle allowed little more than the view of rough masonry retreating into shadow. "I dare say this passage hasn't been touched in decades," I murmured, aware of a curious tightening in my chest. "Decades," Holmes replied softly. "I'd wager 16 years, give or take a fortnight." The number struck like a chime through my thoughts. The year James Godfrey died. Precisely. He handed me the candle and reached into the recess. His fingers moved slowly, carefully, feeling along the inner stone. Then, with a small grunt, he withdrew something. A folded scrap of cloth wrapped tightly about an object. He unfurled it on the chapel floor. Within lay a silver match case, tarnished with age but unmistakably personal, bearing the engraved initials J.G. Could it have belonged to the brother? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Holmes was already studying the cloth, not the case. "This is newer," he murmured. "Note the weave. Cotton linen blend, common to post-war tailors. But the object itself." He turned the case over in his hands, tapping it lightly against his palm. "This is the bait. The cloth is the line. Someone placed this here recently, hoping it would be found." I stared again into the recess, unease prickling my spine. Then the voice was a lure, Holmes said. "A performance meant for one audience. Elliot Godfrey." He rose, brushing dust from his coat. "Come, Watson. I believe it is time we spoke to Mrs. Godfrey." We returned to the house without fanfare, moving silently through corridors dimly lit by wall lamps. The house had taken on a strange stillness, not from sleep but from something held, coiled and waiting. We found Mrs. Godfrey in the morning room, seated upright in a hard-backed chair by the fire. She was a woman of quiet strength, her features drawn with time and tension, her hair tucked in an austere bun that did not match the gentleness of her eyes. A book lay open in her lap, unread. "You've been in the chapel," she said without looking up. Holmes approached her slowly. "Yes, we found the voice behind the wall." She looked at him then sharply. "So it was real?" "The voice? Likely a ventriloquism of sorts. The space within the wall allows sound to travel, perhaps through a concealed pipe or aperture. But what is real, Mrs. Godfrey, is the intent behind it. Someone wished to convince your husband that the dead were speaking." She closed the book. "Then it's not madness." "No," Holmes said gently. "And you knew it wasn't." She gave a small, brittle laugh. "He was so certain it was James. I didn't know how to speak against it without wounding him." Holmes leaned forward, folding his hands. "Tell me, madam, what was your relationship with your brother-in-law?" There was a pause. "James was magnetic, brilliant even, but careless with hearts. Mine included once." Holmes did not blink. "And your husband knew of it?" "He did. Eventually, he was always the steadier one. He married me despite what had passed between James and me. Or perhaps because of it. He was a man who needed to right things. Did James fall? Or was he pushed?" Her gaze flickered. "You think Elliot—" "No," Holmes said. "I think James Godfrey may not have died as simply as the record suggests. And someone is very eager to keep his memory in motion. We left her then." Her hands clenched around that closed book, as if it could anchor her to the present. Back in the guest chamber, Holmes stood by the window overlooking the chapel. The mist had thickened, curling around the stones like smoke. His expression was unreadable. "This estate," he said at length, "has long corridors and longer shadows, and now we know there is more than one passage behind the walls." I nodded. "You think someone is using the hidden architecture to move about unseen, or to listen, or to frighten? Possibly all three?" He turned suddenly. "We need to speak to the gardener." We found the man in the early morning light, stacking wood beneath the eaves of the kitchen house. He was a wiry fellow near 60, with a leathered face and a perpetual squint, as though the world never quite resolved into clarity. "Name's Hill," he said, wiping his hands on his apron. "Been here longer than the Godfreys themselves." "Then perhaps you can tell us," Holmes said mildly, "whether there are old passages within the chapel wall." "One's not visible to the eye." Hill straightened, eyes narrowing. "Aye, there's talk of 'em. Old monks, before the Grange was a home, used to keep their wine and bones in the wall. Not many left who remember it. But the chapel was hollow in places, that much is true. Did James Godfrey ever go poking around there?" Hill's jaw tightened. He was the type who'd pry open a coffin just to see how it smelled. "Forgive me, Doctor, but he wasn't like Mr. Elliot. He had no respect for walls or graves. Did you see him fall?" "No one did. Only heard the cry. Who found the body?" "I did. Bent backwards he was. At the base of the west wall. They said he slipped. But I've always thought—" "Yes?" Hill looked away. "He didn't look like a man who fell. He looked like a man who landed." Holmes gave a faint hum of interest. That night, Holmes requested that I remain awake with him. We positioned ourselves again in the chapel, this time with both candles extinguished. The opening in the wall had been closed carefully, so as not to alert whoever had placed the object inside. We waited in silence. At precisely 2 o'clock, a faint rustle. Then, just above us, a breath. Not a voice this time, but the unmistakable sound of air moving through a narrow pipe or tube. Holmes tapped my arm, signaling silence. A moment later, a shape passed along the outside wall. A shadow, faint but distinct. Holmes moved like lightning, rushing around the chapel's far side. I followed, my boots crunching on gravel. By the time we rounded the wall, the shape had vanished, but Holmes bent down and retrieved something from the base of the outer stone, a folded scrap of paper. He opened it beneath the moonlight. A single line was scrawled in harsh, uneven ink. "He knows. Stop digging." Holmes folded the paper and placed it in his coat. "The voice, Watson, is not merely a trick of stone. It is a warning. And I believe someone in this house is desperate to keep the past buried, even if it means sending Elliot Godfrey into madness." I stared at the chapel wall, now quiet and cold once more. I could almost believe it had exhaled. Holmes was already walking back toward the house. "It is no longer a question of if James Godfrey was murdered," he said, "but rather, who has kept the secret these 16 years, and why now they fear its return." The house was still when we returned, but it was not the stillness of peace. It was that particular silence one finds just after a door has closed, or a breath has been held too long, as though the Grange itself was listening now, wary of our footsteps. Holmes walked ahead with the paper in his pocket, his face unreadable in the low light. I knew that expression well. It meant he had formed the skeleton of a theory, though he was not yet ready to dress it in flesh. Once inside, we lit only one lamp. Holmes motioned for me to draw the curtains while he settled at the writing desk. He placed the threatening scrap of paper beside the tarnished match case and the cloth that had wrapped it. From his coat he also drew the pocket lens, a small brush, and a bottle of clear fluid. I leaned over his shoulder as he worked, the flame casting twin shadows of us across the floorboards. "The handwriting," I murmured. "Rushed. Deliberately unsteady," Holmes replied. "The slant is natural for someone right-handed, but exaggerated, possibly an attempt at disguise. Ink is cheap, recent, and the paper," he held it up to the light, "comes from a ledger book. The faint grid lines confirm it. Not the sort of thing kept by a servant. More likely someone with legal training. Or a habit of keeping accounts." He turned it over. "A watermark. Just visible. Bennett's and Cray Law Stationers, Chancery Lane." "That's a London brand," I said. "Indeed. And quite expensive." He set it down and rubbed his fingers together thoughtfully. "We must consider that the person who placed this note believed Elliot Godfrey might crack, that the fear alone would unmoor him. You think it's someone close to him? I think it must be. The wall's construction, the timing of the voice, the placement of the match case, all require not only access but knowledge. Intimate knowledge. Someone who has lived here long enough to know that particular passage exists, and someone with reason to silence a memory. I hesitated, then voiced a question I had turned over quietly since our return. Do you believe Mrs. Godfrey could be involved? Holmes did not answer at once. He stood and moved to the fireplace, stoking the coals gently, watching the orange light flare and fall. At last he said, "She is grieving something, but not her brother-in-law. Perhaps not even her husband. I suspect she is mourning a version of herself that no longer fits this house." The statement, though vague, struck me as deeply true. We rose before dawn, not to return to the chapel, but to the eastern end of the estate, where Holmes had noticed a low utility door hidden behind a hedgerow. With Hill's reluctant help and a borrowed key, we gained access to what proved to be an underground storeroom, thick with cobwebs and the smell of dried lime. "Look here, Watson," Holmes said, gesturing toward the interior wall. "This is the back side of the chapel. The foundations run through here. And see these lines? Electrical conduit, poorly fitted. Someone's attempted to run a wire or pipe through the old masonry, and done so quite recently." He followed the line upward, where it disappeared into a hole barely wide enough for a thumb. Holmes retrieved a rod from the gardener's shed and slipped it into the hole. It moved easily, tapping against something metal. "A voice tube," he said softly. "A simple speaking device like those used on naval ships. You speak at one end and the sound travels cleanly to the other. The chapel's echo would distort it, making it seem more spectral." I stared. Then the voice wasn't just metaphorically false. It was quite literally manufactured. Yes. Holmes stood, brushing dust from his knees. Now the question becomes, and who built it and why now? Later that morning, we convened again with Elliot Godfrey. He met us in his study, where a fire had already been lit and a tea service stood untouched beside his desk. He looked tired but steadier somehow. The weight of the voice had been replaced by the weight of suspicion. Holmes wasted no time. "Mr. Godfrey," he said, "when your brother James died, did you believe it was an accident?" Elliot stared into the fire. "I tried to. Did you and he quarrel before the fall?" He nodded. "We had words. Strong ones. He accused me of betrayal. I accused him of deceit. Was this over your wife?" A pause, then, "In part, but more than that. James had been involved in a scheme, a financial one. Fraudulent land deeds, if memory serves. I discovered the papers in his study and threatened to expose him. He vanished for a week, returned with some story of clerical error. And then the fall." Holmes sat opposite him. "You inherited everything." Elliot looked up. "Yes. And your wife, has she ever spoken of that time?" "Rarely. She hated it. Hated what it did to us. We married quietly the following spring." There were whispers. Holmes rose. "Mr. Godfrey, I believe someone in this house has preserved your brother's secrets, and now they are trying to weaponize your doubt against you." Elliot's face paled. "You think they want me to go mad?" Holmes did not reply. Instead, he moved to the bookcase. With deliberate slowness, he began running his fingers along the spines until he stopped at one near the top, the Book of Common Prayer. He pulled it forward. The shelf gave a small click and a portion of the wood swung outward. Behind it, darkness. And stairs descending. Holmes turned, grim satisfaction in his eyes. The house, he said, was built over something much older. We descended together, Holmes, Elliot, and I, into a narrow stairwell that twisted once before opening into a stone passage, damp with age. It ran parallel to the chapel, then beneath it, leading to a small chamber lined with rusted shelving. The air was thick, stale, but dry enough to preserve what lay upon the floor. Old account books, bound ledgers, and in one corner, a broken recorder pipe, the twin to the one Holmes had discovered earlier. Holmes knelt and lifted a journal. "Bennett's and Cray," he murmured, showing us the cover. The same stationery that produced the warning note. He flipped open the book. Names, dates, parcels of land, and signatures. One in particular appeared again and again. "E. Godfrey," I read aloud. But Holmes shook his head. "Look again." He handed me the match case, and beneath the initials J.G. scratched faintly into the silver were the words, "For what we built together." It was James, Holmes said, forging his brother's signature, masking his dealings. When Elliot discovered it, he confronted him. James must have panicked. Perhaps he fell while trying to destroy the evidence, or someone stopped him. Elliot was white as bone. Then who is doing this now? Holmes replaced the ledger, rose slowly and said, only someone who knew about the ledgers, the match case and the passage, someone who lived with James, who loved him, and who never forgave his death. We returned to the study where Mrs. Godfrey was already waiting. She stood when we entered, but did not speak. Her eyes searched her husband's face, then Holmes's, and in that silent examination the truth hung heavy in the room. You found it, didn't you? She said. Her voice was even but low. Holmes nodded. The records, the passage, and the voice tube. She sighed once like a weight had slipped from her shoulders. He was all I had, she said. James, before Elliot, before this house and this life. I knew he was reckless, but he never meant harm. When he died, they buried him and all his lies with him. But I never forgot. You've been trying to punish your husband, Holmes said quietly, by raising ghosts. No, not punish, she replied. Remind. Elliot stepped forward but said nothing. The look they exchanged then, of betrayal, of grief, of too many unsaid years, was not one I could intrude upon. Holmes looked to me. We'll leave in the morning. And we did. But as the train pulled away from Lichfield, I could not help but glance back once more toward the fog-shrouded spire of the old Abbey wall, wondering, not for the first time, whether the dead ever truly sleep, or whether they simply wait until someone dares to listen again. The train had scarcely cleared the last of the hedgerows when Holmes turned his face from the window and lit a fresh match to his pipe. The scent of sulphur mingled with the faint leather of the carriage, and I could feel the weight of unspoken conclusions hanging between us. I waited, knowing better than to press him in his first moments of silence. Holmes required these brief silences to sharpen what he already knew, like a blade honed after a long cut. At last he said, "It is not finished." I glanced at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Godfrey as much as confessed. She constructed the illusion, kept the memory of James alive, perhaps to settle an old grief. Holmes cut in, his tone calm but firm. She constructed the haunting, yes, but not the deception that cost James his life. That part remains hidden, I stared. But we found the forged ledgers, the voice tubes, the hidden passage. He nodded slowly. Indeed, all very neat. Almost too neat. I frowned, puzzled. You think someone else was involved? I think, Holmes said, folding his hands, that someone has allowed us to believe we've seen the full play, when in truth we've only been shown the final act. Consider, Watson, why would someone go to the effort of threatening Elliot now after all these years? Not merely to stir guilt, but to stop him from digging. What could Elliot Godfrey uncover that would ruin someone else's peace? I opened my mouth, then closed it again. The thought had not occurred to me. The voice behind the wall was a decoy, yes, but perhaps not just for Elliot. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to that taut register I had come to associate with moments of highest tension. The question is not why Mrs. Godfrey impersonated her dead lover. The question is who knew she was doing so, and used her distraction to bury a different truth. The idea bloomed slowly in my mind. Someone had known about the ghostly ruse, perhaps even encouraged it, in order to cover another layer of deception. But who? Holmes tapped the edge of the seat. We must return. Back to Lichfield? Not quite. To London first. There's someone I must speak to. And so that afternoon we arrived in Baker Street under a fresh drizzle, the streets gleaming with November's dull mirror light. Holmes wasted no time. He sent a wire to a firm in Chancery Lane and made arrangements to meet with one Mr. Walter Finch, clerk of Bennett's and Cray, law stationers. By the following morning, we were seated across from the man in a cramped office filled with paper dust and copperplate receipts. Finch was eager, perhaps too eager to be helpful. "Ah, yes, the watermark," he said cheerfully, peering over his spectacles. "Issued to only a handful of legal clients. Very high-end stock, that one. Watermarked quarterly. You said you found it in a private residence." "I did," Holmes replied. "Tell me, would you happen to know which firms or individuals ordered this batch?" Finch considered. "We track clients by batch number. If you know the month." "October of last year," Holmes said promptly. "Ah, then that narrows it. Finch opened a large registry and ran his finger down the page. "Let me see. Yes, there it is. Batch 18G. That was ordered by a Mr. Franklin Hill." My heart gave a strange little start. "The gardener?" Holmes merely nodded. "Does he order often?" "Not at all. That was the only purchase. Collected it himself. Paid in cash." Outside in the fog, Holmes paused under the overhang of the building and struck another match. "Hill," I said, my voice low. "He found the body, you'll recall. Said James didn't fall, that he looked like a man who landed. Yes, and he was the only one who saw the body before it was moved." "You think he was involved in the death?" "I think he saw more than he admitted. And I think he's kept that knowledge buried, perhaps quite literally, for 16 years. Until now. But why would he begin to stir trouble now?" "That," Holmes said, stepping out into the rain, "is what we're about to ask him." We returned to the Grange late that afternoon. Elliot Godfrey received us with surprise and a trace of something else, something near relief. "I hadn't expected to see you again," he said, closing the door behind us. Holmes studied him a moment, then said, "Nor had we expected to return. But your gardener, Hill, has a rather long memory and a poor habit of cleaning up old threads." Godfrey blinked. "Hill? But he's been with us for decades. That would make him the likeliest candidate for long-term guilt," Holmes said dryly. "Where is he now?" "In the tool shed, I believe. I sent him to repair one of the gate hinges." Holmes turned on his heel. "Come, Watson." We crossed the grounds briskly. The sky was low, threatening, as if the very clouds were listening. At the shed, Hill was bent over a workbench, his back to us. He turned as we entered, wiping his hands. "Mr. Holmes." "Mr. Hill," Holmes said calmly. "I believe we must speak plainly now. You've lived with a secret a very long time." Hill's face, weathered and leathery, did not change. "You found the ledger, then?" "We did. You think I forged those records?" "No," Holmes said. "But I believe you witnessed James Godfrey's death. And I believe you've been helping to preserve a version of the story that does not disturb the estate." Hill set down the spanner he'd been holding. "You're wrong." "Am I?" Holmes stepped forward. "Then explain the ledger paper you purchased, the warning note you planted, the match case you removed from the body before the others arrived." Hill flinched, just slightly. But to Holmes that was enough. "You didn't kill him, Mr. Hill, but you saw who did." The silence was like frost. Hill sat slowly on the edge of the workbench. "He was already dead when I got there, but I knew who'd done it. I saw her leave. White gloves. Pale boots, not meant for mud." My breath caught. "Mrs. Godfrey?" Hill shook his head. "No, sir." He looked up, eyes sharp now. "It was Miss Isabel Carr." Holmes froze. "The vicar's niece?" Hill nodded grimly. "They were lovers, James and her. She came often, always through the back. The night he died, I saw them arguing near the west wall. She pushed him, not hard. But he was standing on the edge of the old buttress. He lost his balance. He fell wrong. I ran to him, but he was already gone." Holmes's face was still. "And you told no one? Would you have, sir?" "The vicar's niece. A scandal would have ruined her, the Godfreys, the village. The vicar asked me to keep quiet, paid me to. Said she'd never recover." "She didn't," Holmes said. "She died of pneumonia the following winter. I remember the notice now." "No mention of James." Hill bowed his head. "I never forgave myself." "You should have spoken then," Holmes said, not unkindly. "Instead, you tried to bury it again." Hill looked up. "I didn't plant the voice. That weren't me. But when it started, I knew someone was stirring the ashes. So I left the warning, not to frighten Elliot, to frighten her, Mrs. Godfrey. I thought she was trying to unearth what we'd all buried." Holmes turned to me, then back to Hill. "But she only wanted to speak to a ghost," he murmured, "not to expose a crime." That evening, Holmes made a quiet report to Elliot, who sat pale and wordless for some time after. No public accusations followed. No scandal. Hill remained in service. The dead, once again, were allowed to rest, though now at least someone had spoken the truth aloud. We left the following morning, the mist curling behind us like old parchment curling over a fire. And though Holmes said little on the train, I knew that somewhere behind his steady gaze, he was already moving toward the next shadow. But I, for my part, could not help but wonder how many Abbey walls still held voices, how many lies still echoed in the stone, and how many men had convinced themselves they were silent. The slow rhythm of the train as it left Lichfield seemed to mimic the weight of reflection pressing down on both of us. Holmes sat with his hands steepled beneath his chin, his gaze not on the passing countryside, but fixed somewhere inward, a plain beyond the misted glass. I knew from experience that this silence meant something still troubled him, a misfitting detail, a contradiction too subtle for ordinary eyes, but not for his. "I'm not satisfied," he murmured at last. I looked up from my notebook. "But we've uncovered the truth." Hill confirmed what happened. James was pushed by Isabel Carr. The voice behind the wall was an unrelated masquerade, one born of guilt, not malice. He nodded once. "Each piece aligns neatly, yes. A confession from Hill, emotional clarity from Mrs. Godfrey. Yet it is precisely the neatness that troubles me. Life is rarely so tidy." I waited, knowing that a fuller thought would soon follow. Holmes turned slightly, his voice low and even. "Why did Mrs. Godfrey revive the ghost of her brother-in-law this year, Watson? Not 5 years ago, not 10. And why now, precisely when Elliot Godfrey had begun making inquiries into his brother's remaining estate holdings?" I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the carriage air. "You believe the haunting was not merely emotional, that it was timed?" "I believe it was permitted," Holmes said. "Perhaps even suggested." I leaned back slowly. "Then who would gain from such a deception?" Holmes tapped the edge of the window frame, his expression still distant. "Elliot Godfrey's health has faltered, has it not?" He looked worn, more so than a man of his years should. Suppose he had been convinced of his own mental decline, by whispers in the night, strange voices no one else could hear, objects misplaced, phantom sounds. What might he have done? I answered before I fully realized the implication. He might begin to settle his affairs. Sign away property, entrust decisions to someone close. Holmes met my gaze. Exactly. Now ask yourself, who would be close enough to benefit and cautious enough to hide behind both Mrs. Godfrey's grief and Hill's silence? The name formed in my mind like frost on glass. "The solicitor," I said quietly. "Godfrey's man of affairs." Holmes nodded once. "Mr. Simon Caro." I had barely spoken to the man during our visit. He had appeared only once, polite, dry, indistinct. Precisely the sort of presence that recedes into the background while shaping everything within it. He oversaw James's estate after his death, Holmes continued, remained close to Elliot thereafter. It was he, I suspect, who arranged the quiet burial, the transfer of titles. Perhaps it was even he who advised Hill to say nothing all those years ago, using Hill's sense of duty to preserve the reputation of the vicar's niece. And now? Now, Holmes said, with Elliot's mind uncertain and old papers resurfacing, Caro may have seen the need to move more quickly, to distract, to confuse, to ensure no one looked too closely at what had been quietly misappropriated. I let out a breath. "You think the records of James's estate were altered?" "I think," Holmes replied, "that James's death was not merely a tragedy of passion, as we've been led to believe, but a convenient one. And there is still a signature in that ledger book we haven't examined carefully enough. When we arrived in London, Holmes wasted no time. He sent 2 telegrams, one to the Land Office in Staffordshire, requesting access to property archives related to the Godfrey estate, and another to a handwriting expert by the name of Ellis Markham, a man with whom Holmes had collaborated on at least 3 forgery cases. By the following evening, the 2 men were seated across from one another in our Baker Street sitting room, the Godfrey ledger open between them. Holmes spoke with his usual economy. "Page 14. Compare the second entry to the 12th. Markham adjusted his spectacles and examined the script. Same name, E. Godfrey, but the pen pressure is inconsistent. Looping changes. The second entry is smooth, deliberate, written by someone accustomed to signing that name. The 12th, no. This is a forgery," Holmes nodded, "and likely done by someone who had access to the real signature." Markham studied the ink more closely. "Different batch of ink, too. Slightly bluer. I'd say the second signature was added several months after the others. A clever touch, but not clever enough." When he left, Holmes turned to me with a look of grim satisfaction. "We now have proof that someone forged Elliot's name in estate transfers following James's death. That transfer included a parcel of land that had quietly increased in value, thanks no doubt to insider knowledge. And Caro? Caro, I suspect, not only managed the forgery, but used the entire haunting illusion as cover, encouraging Mrs. Godfrey's grief, subtly feeding it, until she built a ghost story believable enough to discredit her husband if he questioned too much. A sudden clarity struck me. That explains the ledger paper. Hill thought he was protecting a memory, but Caro was protecting an embezzlement. Holmes's eyes narrowed, and using Hill to do it. We returned to Abbott's Grange the next day unannounced. This time we asked not for Elliot, nor for Mrs. Godfrey, but went directly to the solicitor's office in the rear wing. A handsome room filled with thin drawers, scroll tubes and ledgers neatly lined upon the shelves. Mr. Caro greeted us with a small, curious smile. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I thought your business here was concluded." Holmes stepped forward. "On the contrary, it is only now properly beginning." Caro blinked. "I don't follow." "You followed rather too closely, Mr. Caro, through forgery, concealment and misdirection. You permitted a grieving widow to construct a ghost, then ensured her husband would believe it. Meanwhile, you forged his name on property transfers. You used Hill's silence, manipulated a story of romantic tragedy, and hoped no one would examine the accounts too closely. A clever scheme and nearly successful." For a moment, Caro's expression did not change. Then something flickered, as not fear but resentment. "You have no evidence." Holmes drew a folded paper from his coat. "This is a professional analysis of your forgery, backed by official Land Office records. And this," he produced a second slip, "is a copy of a letter you sent to Mrs. Godfrey 4 months ago, encouraging her to explore the symbols of grief and suggesting she return to the chapel regularly for reflection." Caro's mouth thinned. She was depressed. "I offered support." "You offered fuel," Holmes said coldly. "You saw her guilt and fed it, knowing she would unwittingly serve as a distraction. Your mistake was trusting that no one would question a ghost." Caro said nothing. Holmes took a final step closer. "I've already notified the Land Tribunal. If you confess, you may yet avoid prison. But if you force my hand, the charges will include fraud, conspiracy, and psychological manipulation." Caro's shoulders sagged. It was Elliot Godfrey who signed the formal complaint 3 days later. His hand trembled as he wrote, but he made no protest. When we left the Grange for the final time, Mrs. Godfrey stood in the doorway. She did not ask for explanation. Her eyes met Holmes's, and there was something like a weary gratitude there. The strange relief that comes from learning that madness was never yours to begin with. As we boarded the train once more, Holmes settled back and lit a cigarette with slow satisfaction. "Well, Watson, a haunting resolved, a murderer named, and a thief exposed, all in the space of a single crumbling chapel. And only one voice behind the wall," I added. Holmes smiled faintly. "One voice, yes, but many echoes." We rode in silence after that, the countryside unrolling once more beyond the glass, pale and indistinct. And somewhere in the folds of that quiet English land, the truth lay buried at last, not by secrecy, but by understanding. The afternoon light was thinning as the train neared London, slanting through the windows like memory itself, soft, fractured, and golden around the edges. Holmes had closed his eyes, though I doubted he slept. His fingers twitched now and then against the fabric of his coat, as though playing scales only he could hear. I left him to his thoughts, but mine refused such order. Though the case at Abbott's Grange had seemingly concluded, the haunting exposed, the forgeries revealed, and the solicitor in custody, I felt the peculiar unrest that only follows certain resolutions, not the unease of doubt, but of unfinished weight. And as if conjured by my thoughts, Holmes stirred and opened his eyes. "You're thinking of Elliot," he said, not looking at me. I nodded. "I can't quite put it away. He signed the complaint, yes, but he looked hollow. As though justice had done nothing to fill the space James once left behind." Holmes's gaze lingered on the horizon. "That's the trouble with truths, Watson. Some, when uncovered, do not restore. They merely expose how long the lie has been allowed to take root." He fell quiet again, but I sensed a flicker of reluctance in him, as though he had not shared the full breadth of his deduction. I knew better than to press, and yet the silence pressed harder. At Baker Street, a letter was waiting. Mrs. Hudson handed it to Holmes, with that familiar flicker of curiosity she never quite managed to suppress, around sealed envelopes addressed in thick, unfamiliar script. Holmes broke the wax with his thumb and scanned the contents without sitting. Then he passed the note to me. "It was from Elliot Godfrey, Mr. Holmes. I thank you for the clarity you have brought to this wretched affair. But I must confess something I did not reveal during your visit. There is a final matter, one I dare not speak of in writing. I ask only that you return just once more, and see for yourself what has remained hidden, not beneath floorboards, nor in ledgers, but in blood. Come at night. Do not inform my wife." Godfrey, I lowered the letter slowly, my hand tightening. He's not done with the past. Holmes moved immediately, calling for his coat. We arrived at the Grange just before midnight. The air was colder now, the mist heavier. Holmes insisted we come by foot from the village, approaching through the woods instead of the main road. There was something in his manner, alert, sharp-edged, that made me scan the trees with equal caution. A dim light glowed in the west wing. Elliot stood at the threshold alone, wrapped in a dark overcoat that looked too large for him now. Grief, like illness, had stripped him of weight and shape. He spoke before we reached the steps. "I need to show you where it happened." We followed him through the house, not to the chapel this time, but to a stairwell behind the drawing room, one I hadn't noticed before. Narrow and steep, leading downward into what I assumed was a root cellar. The air grew colder as we descended. At the base, Elliot unlocked a thick wooden door and led us into a room entirely unlike the others in the house. There was no dust here, no signs of long abandonment. The floor was swept, the stone shelves neatly arranged. And at the center of the far wall, sealed behind a pane of thick glass, was a single object, a blood-stained coat. I stepped closer, stunned. It was old, black wool gone soft with time, one sleeve torn, the collar frayed. And yet the blood, dark brown now, had soaked so deeply into the fabric that it could not have been theatrical. It was real. The pattern of it, streaked across the shoulder and back, suggested force, not accident. Elliot stood still beside it, breathing unevenly. "It was hidden in a compartment beneath the stair," he said. "Caro claimed to have removed all of James's belongings, but this he kept locked away." Holmes stepped forward, examining the display as though it were a crime scene freshly made. He didn't speak for several moments. Then he asked very quietly, "Why show us this now?" "Because," Elliot said, and his voice shook, "it doesn't make sense. If James fell, he simply fell. Why would Caro hide the coat?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And why," Elliot continued, "is there a puncture tear beneath the blood?" I moved forward. Elliot was right. Near the lower right flank, the coat bore a hole, not torn by stone or snagged by a fall. It was precise, sharp-edged, as if made by a blade. "Stabbed," I breathed, "before he fell." Holmes nodded slowly. "Then the fall was not an accident at all. Not even born of panic." We turned to Elliot, who had closed his eyes. I believed for years that Isabel Carr had pushed him, that she was volatile, emotional. I accepted that. But I never questioned the conclusion. Not until the voices. Not until you. And now. "Now," Holmes said, "you believe someone murdered your brother with full intent." Elliot opened his eyes. "And I believe I know who." The silence that followed was like the moment before a storm breaks. "It wasn't Isabel," he said. "She had no reason to kill him, even if they quarreled. But Caro," Holmes's voice was a whisper, "he forged the land transfers and had access to everything," Elliot said. "My accounts. James's will. He had motive, profit. He knew of James's schemes and probably feared exposure if James confessed. Isabel may have witnessed the quarrel, but she didn't kill him. Caro did. Which means," I added, "that Hill saw the wrong person walk away, or was made to think so," Holmes said grimly. "White gloves. Pale boots, easily obtained, especially if you wish to disguise your own gait and body. A misdirection planted in a gardener's frightened memory." Elliot walked to the edge of the coat display and knelt, brushing his hand across the sealed glass. "I lived all these years thinking I drove my brother to recklessness, that I had pushed too hard, exposed too much. But it wasn't guilt that killed him. It was ambition." Holmes placed a hand gently on Elliot's shoulder. "You must have this examined formally," he said. "The authorities will want the coat. And the evidence may be enough to reopen the case." Elliot nodded. "I'll do it. But I wanted you to see it first. You brought the silence to light. I thought you deserved to hear the last whisper it contained." We left him standing in the low chamber, bathed in the pale glow of the lantern, his face calm in a way I had not seen since our first arrival. He had lived with ghosts, and he had finally named them. Outside, the sky was beginning to grey with dawn. We walked back in silence. At the edge of the woods, Holmes paused and looked back at the manor, its upper windows dark, its chimney just beginning to stir with life again. I said before that it was not finished, he murmured. And now? I asked. He gave the faintest smile. Now it is. And with that, we turned our backs to the voice behind the wall and left the dead, at last, to rest. The walk back to the village was slow and unhurried, as though each step was loosening the tension that had knotted itself through every corridor of Abbott's Grange. Holmes, usually brisk and economical in motion, let the silence stretch. The air had taken on the colourless chill of early morning, and the trees no longer whispered with secrets, only with the rustle of wind in brittle leaves. The ghost was gone, and yet something in Holmes's carriage told me his mind was not finished with the matter. We reached the inn before the town had properly stirred. Over weak tea and dry toast, Holmes finally spoke, his fingers absently turning the teaspoon clockwise. "You see, Watson," he said, "truth is a matter not only of evidence, but of readiness. Elliot Godfrey could not have seen that coat 10 years ago and drawn the same conclusion, nor could Mrs. Godfrey have heard her own grief for what it truly was. Time had to pass. The house had to creak. The voices, imagined or real, had to speak." I watched him carefully. "And you? Were you ready for what we found?" Holmes looked up, and there was something in his eyes I had not seen before. Not exactly sorrow, but a rare flicker of admission. I misjudged. Not the facts. Those were sound. But I underestimated how far a man might go to keep a death convenient. He fell quiet again, then straightened as though shaking off a coat too heavy to wear. "There is one last visit we must make before returning to London." It was nearing midday when we arrived at the Lichfield Parish Archive. The records clerk was a young woman with sharp eyes and a penchant for speed, the sort Holmes approved of immediately. He explained what we sought: original death records for James Godfrey, and any corresponding burial reports, including the undertaker's ledger and the coroner's notes, if they had survived. The clerk nodded and vanished into the shelves. Holmes and I waited in a narrow alcove, flanked by 2 high windows. The sunlight was weak but clean, and it etched Holmes's face into sharper relief than usual. The high brow, the hawkish nose, the ever-moving gaze. The girl returned swiftly, setting down a slim bundle of tied parchment and 2 thin ledgers. Holmes handled them as reverently as relics. He opened the burial record first. James Godfrey. Died October 1875. Interred October 19th. Attending physician Dr. Reeve. No autopsy. Cause of death listed as fall from structure, blunt trauma to skull and upper spine. Holmes frowned. "No autopsy," he murmured. "Convenient." He turned to the undertaker's record. It included standard notations: coffin size, materials, burial date, who ordered the service, and then in faint ink, a footnote. Coat removed prior to viewing. Replaced with family cloak. Stains not suitable for display. Holmes tapped it once. He bled. More than we were led to believe. He pulled the death certificate from the folder, and there, in a slightly different hand, was a second note, one I nearly missed. Initial witness S. Carrow, confirmed identity. No family present at first examination. He folded the certificate gently. Carrow was there first, Holmes said. Before Elliot, before even Hill. He confirmed the body, likely ensured the coat was hidden. If the puncture wound was not immediately visible, if the body lay with its side against the stone, then the injury could have passed as a fall. We returned the materials and left the archive without speaking. Only as we reached the churchyard wall, where the Godfrey family plot sat shaded by ancient yews, did Holmes stop. The stone was still there, as we had seen it days earlier. James Godfrey. 1851-1875. He spoke often of truth. Holmes crouched beside it and ran a finger along the base. "Do you notice anything unusual, Watson?" I knelt, examining the inscription more closely. No cracks. No chipping. Rather clean for a grave this old. Too clean, Holmes said. "Someone maintains it." He pointed subtly to the base of the next stone over. Moss and lichen had overtaken much of it, but James's stone stood sharp-edged, cared for. "Mrs. Godfrey?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "She avoids this place. She said so herself." Hill, I considered. He might feel guilt. Holmes rose. Or perhaps someone else has returned here, not out of mourning, but to ensure the truth remained buried. That afternoon, back at the village inn, Holmes took out a small notebook and flipped through several loose pages until he reached a sketch he had made early in the case. The map of Abbott's Grange, including the location of the hidden passage behind the chapel wall, the route through the cellar, and the blind staircase near the drawing room. He laid it flat between us. There was one more passage, he said. Elliot never knew of it. But Caro must have. He traced his finger along the foundation lines. Here, under the west corridor, there's an unaccounted-for gap in the stone floor. It would have allowed someone to access the cellar and place the coat behind the glass compartment after the murder, but before the burial. My mind raced. Do you believe Caro hid the coat after killing James, knowing it would one day be found, but on his terms? Possibly, Holmes said. Or he kept it as leverage, proof of his own power. There is something about murderers, Watson, the clever ones especially. They do not simply erase the crime. They often leave behind a token, a private monument, something that proves to themselves they won. But he lost, I said. Holmes looked at me, his face unreadable. Did he? He asked quietly. Caro died with his secret intact. He was exposed only through your persistence and Elliot's guilt. He evaded justice until the very end. I could not argue with that. Holmes leaned back, drawing a slow breath. Still, he said, perhaps that is justice enough. That even in death his lie did not hold. We returned to London that evening. The streets were slick with recent rain, and the lamplight played gold along the cobblestones. Holmes moved with the faint fatigue of a man whose mind had worked harder than his feet. And for once I felt the same. At Baker Street, as Mrs. Hudson brought us tea and laid a small fire, Holmes sat near the hearth, staring into the coals. He did not speak for a long time. At last he said, "There are voices behind many walls, Watson. Most never speak, but when they do, it is our duty to listen." I nodded. My own thoughts wrapped around the Grange, the coat, the voice, the blood, and sometimes, I added, it is our duty to answer. Holmes did not smile, but I saw a quiet agreement flicker in his gaze. The case of the voice behind the Abbey wall had ended, not with a gavel, nor with the clang of prison doors, but with something rarer, more difficult to define. It had ended with silence, but this time it was the kind that meant peace. It was 3 days after our return to Baker Street that the envelope arrived, hand-delivered. No postmark, the wax seal unbroken but slightly smudged as though it had been clutched too tightly. Holmes turned it over once before opening it. I caught a glimpse of the paper inside, thick, cream-colored, of a weight and grain I recognized instantly from our time at Abbott's Grange. Elliot Godfrey's stationery. Holmes read it in silence. Then he passed it to me without a word. "Mr. Holmes, forgive my intrusion. I would not write again were it not for the sudden arrival of a parcel left anonymously at my gate. Within it lies something I do not understand, though I suspect you might." Enclosed was a photograph, one I had never seen, though it clearly belongs to the years just before James died. In it, my brother stands beside Simon Caro in the rear gardens of the Grange. But here is the puzzle. Between them unmistakably is a young boy, barely 10. I do not know this child. Nor did James ever mention him. I fear there may yet be a part of my brother's life we never uncovered, and perhaps a legacy that has only now begun to stir. If you would come once more, I would be grateful. E.G. I finished reading and set the page down carefully. Holmes had already risen and was examining his cabinet of clippings and notes, a quiet ritual he often returned to when fresh shadows began to form behind the veil of a case. "A boy," I said. "Mentioned in no records, no correspondences, yet photographed with James and Caro," Holmes murmured, "and carefully omitted from memory since. But why send it now?" Holmes turned to me, his eyes sharp again. "That is the question, is it not? Who sent the photograph? And why choose this moment after Caro's death, after the truth has been dislodged?" He picked up his watch from the mantel. "We leave on the evening train. We arrived at the Grange beneath a sky streaked with ash-colored dusk. The building seemed changed, though its stones were the same, as though the air around it had drawn tighter, more inward. Elliot met us at the threshold, no longer hollow but resolute, with the photograph in hand. He offered it immediately, his fingers holding the edge as though unwilling to stain it further with speculation. Holmes examined it closely. The image was clear. James Godfrey, younger and vital, his smile relaxed but not careless. Beside him, Simon Carrow, his expression tighter, guarded. But it was the boy between them who drew the eye. Dark-haired, with narrow features and a solemn gaze that felt out of place in a garden. Holmes traced a finger along the edge. "This was taken in summer," he said. "See the flowering clematis over the arch. That dates it to late June or July, 2 years before James's death." He handed the photo to me, then stepped back. "There's no resemblance to Elliot," I noted, "nor to Mrs. Godfrey." "Because," Holmes said quietly, "the resemblance belongs to someone else. Look at the shape of the eyes, the set of the mouth. It struck me then." "Carrow," Holmes nodded. "And James, the child bears features of both, which suggests something neither man ever disclosed." Elliot sank into the nearest chair, his hand pressed to his temple. You think the boy was James's son?" "Possibly," Holmes said. "More likely he was Carrow's. But then, why the photograph?" "Why now?" "Because someone wanted you to see it," Holmes replied. "And more to the point, someone wanted me to see it." He turned abruptly. "I must speak with Hill. We found the gardener by the gatehouse, pruning a frost-bitten hedge." He straightened when he saw us, a guarded weariness in his eyes. "Hill," Holmes began, wasting no time, "do you remember a child visiting the Grange during the summers before James died?" Hill paused, his fingers tightening around the shears. "Aye," he said after a moment. "Quiet boy. Came once or twice. Weren't local. Stayed just a few days. Didn't speak much. Always kept close to Mr. Carrow." Holmes stepped closer. "Did anyone else know of him?" Hill shrugged. "No one asked. Folk didn't poke into Carrow's business. The boy vanished after 74, never saw him again. Did James treat him like family?" Hill considered. "Not exactly. But he weren't cold either. He gave the boy sweets, taught him to play at skittles in the orchard. Like he was caught between roles." Holmes nodded, then turned back toward the house. That evening, Elliot brought out a leather-bound box he had retrieved from the attic. "It was Carrow's," he said, "left behind when he first came to assist my father. I had forgotten it existed. Inside we found letters, not legal drafts or ledgers, but personal correspondences, some addressed in Carrow's unmistakable hand to a woman named Marjorie Talbot, residing in Hampstead. One envelope was thicker than the rest. Inside, a small birth certificate, name William Talbot, father Simon Carrow, mother Marjorie Talbot, born 1865. There was no mention of James. But there, in another folded paper beneath, was a handwritten agreement. To be held in confidence, James Godfrey agrees to provide guardianship over William Talbot in the event of my death or legal compromise. The child shall be schooled under the Godfrey name if necessary, or placed abroad under neutral guardianship. Signed, Simon Carrow. Witnessed James Godfrey. I felt the temperature in the room change. Holmes read it twice, then looked up. Carrow had a son, and James agreed to protect him if anything should happen. Elliot stared at the page. "But the boy vanished." "No," Holmes said. "He was removed, possibly placed in a boarding house, hidden, protected." He turned slowly to us both. The boy would be 30 now, old enough to return, old enough to wonder what happened to his father, and old enough to make inquiries. I understood then what Holmes had suspected all along. The photograph was sent by him, I whispered. Holmes nodded. A quiet message. "I exist. I remember. I know something was hidden." We sat in stillness as the wind rose outside. The case, it seemed, had not ended with a coat or a confession. It had only paused, awaiting, like a voice behind the wall, for someone to listen again. The fire in the drawing room had dwindled to embers by the time Holmes spoke again. He sat forward, elbows resting on his knees, the photograph of the boy balanced between his fingers. Elliot Godfrey had long since retired upstairs, and only the faint creak of old wood marked the hour's passage. The Grange had grown still again, not the uneasy quiet of secrets withheld, but the deep hush that precedes the stirring of something long buried. Holmes tapped the photograph once, then turned to me. "We must find him," he said. "This William Talbot, or whatever name he goes by now." I nodded. "But where would he have gone?" "There's no mention of schooling, no address beyond the name of his mother." Holmes retrieved the letters from Carrow's box once more and thumbed through them with quiet efficiency. Caro would have left no trail unless necessary. But Marjorie Talbot, she was the constant. He corresponded with her for nearly 7 years, until 1874. That's the last date I see here. He pulled one envelope aside. This one was returned. Address crossed out, forwarded to a Mr. Underley, a name I recall from a prior case. He operated a private estate school in Sussex. For boys of delicate reputation or uncertain guardianship, discreet, expensive, and deeply loyal to their patrons. He handed it to me. We start there. By the next morning we were en route to Sussex. The journey was short, but the countryside seemed to stretch longer than it should have, as though time itself resisted our approach to a place built on half-promises and the concealment of inconvenient children. The gates of Underley School stood high and ivy-draped, its stone walls cool and aloof against the pale sunlight. The headmaster received us in his study, a wood-panelled room lined with old clocks and older books. Yes, we had a William Talbot, he said, after reviewing the records Holmes requested. Enrolled under that name in late 1874, stayed until his 16th year, then left for France under sponsorship. No forwarding address, no family visits recorded. Holmes's eyes narrowed. And his behavior here, quiet, observant, a reader, not close to the others. But polite always. The headmaster paused. He received one visitor during his time here, a gentleman never named, though the man signed the guest book simply as J.G., I remember him. Young, well-dressed, left nothing but a signed edition of Plutarch's Lives in the boy's trunk. Holmes gave a faint nod. James Godfrey. We asked to see the visitor ledger, and there, beneath the curling signature, Holmes found a clue I would have missed entirely. The ink was slightly smudged at the base of the G, a small swipe downward. Holmes stared at it for several seconds. "Watson," he said slowly, "how often do you see a left-handed man blot the lower left of a capital letter?" I blinked. "Never. A left-handed writer blots the right, especially with fountain ink." "Exactly." This was not James. Caro forged the visit. He rose abruptly. "Which means William Talbot may never have known who his real protector was. We left the school with more than we came for. Not an address, but a narrowing of the path." Holmes, in his silent fashion, had begun constructing a map in his mind, not of geography, but of motive. He stared at the rolling hills outside the window as the train carried us back to London. And when at last he spoke, it was to ask for the Times archive. That evening, in our sitting room at Baker Street, we combed through old editions. Holmes moved like a hawk through the columns, swift, precise, discarding page after page until he stopped at an item in the social notes from the spring of 1883. "A Mr. William Talbot," Holmes read aloud, "reported among the ranks of artists contributing to a travelling exhibition of etchings on the theme of foundations and stonework." He handed it to me, a faint smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "The Abbey wall," I murmured. "He's drawn to stone." "To ruins." Holmes tapped the name of the exhibition's sponsor, the Bloomsbury Society of Architectural Preservation, and within minutes had the address from the directory. The next morning, we found ourselves standing in a modest studio near Bloomsbury Square. The door bore no sign, just a brass plate with the initials W.T. The walls inside were spare, the furniture minimal, but the drawings were extraordinary. Ruins, crypts, worn abbeys, broken staircases, each rendered with delicate, aching precision. And among them, unmistakably, the west wall of Abbott's Grange. We were not alone long. A man entered quietly through the side corridor, tall, thin, with dark hair touched faintly at the temples. His gaze passed over us without alarm, as though he had expected someone, though not necessarily us. "You've come about the photograph," he said. Holmes inclined his head. "We have, and about what you hope to know." William Talbot did not offer us tea, nor did he sit. He stood beside his workbench, a hand resting on a half-completed sketch. "I found it among my mother's things after she died," he said. "The letters, the promise, and the photograph. For years I believed I was no one's son. Then I discovered I was the son of a man too careful to claim me." He lifted the photograph from the bench. "He made James Godfrey my guardian. Not a father, and never that, but someone who knew. And then he vanished. Died, they said. But the man who took care of his affairs, the one named Caro's, he never wrote. Never explained. Only closed doors." Holmes stepped closer. "And so you sent the photograph." "I had to know if the house still held anyone who remembered," William said. If Elliot Godfrey was a man who had inherited silence, or something more, Holmes studied him. "You do not want to claim anything, do you?" "No," William said. "Not the estate, not the name. I want to know if my father died for profit or for protection. I want to know if James Godfrey tried to keep his word." Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew the signed guardianship agreement. William took it with careful hands, eyes scanning the ink. "He did try," Holmes said. "He agreed to protect you. But Caro ensured the world forgot." William nodded, a slow inward gesture. "Then I've heard what I came for." He turned slightly as if to return to his drawing. "I shall not disturb the Grange again," he said. "Let the wall rest now." But Holmes placed a hand gently on the bench. "There's one final thing," he said. "Elliot Godfrey never knew of you, not until last week. But he has made a request." William looked at him. "He would like you to visit," Holmes said. "Not as heir, not as blood, simply as a man who bore the echoes of the same silence." There was a long pause, then at last William nodded. "I will go." We left him there, pencil in hand, line unfinished. And as we stepped once more into the grey London street, I asked Holmes whether justice had finally been done. "No," he said. "But memory has. And that, Watson, is the closest some families ever come." The road to Abbott's Grange one final time felt oddly familiar, as though we were retracing a path worn not by feet, but by memory. The trees arched overhead in their usual hush, but the weight of what was carried between us had shifted. Elliot Godfrey stood waiting at the threshold, not in his old melancholy, but with the quiet anticipation of someone who had summoned a ghost and now awaited the man who carried its echo. William Talbot stepped from the carriage without hesitation. He wore no pretense of ceremony, no affectation of kinship. He carried only a small leather case and a calm that seemed hard-won. They stood opposite one another, neither speaking at first. Then Elliot extended his hand and William took it. There was no awkwardness, no proclamation, simply the joining of two men bound not by blood, but by the long arc of consequence. We were invited into the drawing-room, where the old fire now burned steadily, and the shadows along the panelling felt less ominous than before. Holmes accepted a seat near the hearth, but did not yet remove his gloves. His way of signalling, I knew, that something remained unfinished. Elliot poured 2 glasses of brandy and passed one to William. "It was he who broke the silence first. I never knew," he said. "But I suspected. Caro controlled the story for so long. I didn't question the empty places in it, until Holmes arrived." "Until the wall spoke," William nodded. "And when it did, I listened." Holmes watched them both a moment before rising. "There is one last piece to be laid upon the table," he said. "Not of guilt, that has already been accounted for, but of motive. And clarity." He drew from his coat a folded sheet, the final letter from the Caro archive, which he had not shown until now. "It is a draft." "Never sent," Holmes said, handing it to Elliot. "Written in Caro's hand, dated just 1 week before James's death." Elliot unfolded the page, and I leaned closer to read over his shoulder. "James, you underestimate how dangerous your compassion has become. I know what you promised, and to whom. But you are not this boy's father. I am, and I will not allow your guilt to determine my legacy." "You are speaking too freely. You are drawing attention. If you force this matter into the open, you do not only ruin yourself, you ruin him and me. You once told me there was more than one way to protect a life. I am choosing mine. Stay silent, or be made silent." Holmes let the silence settle before speaking again. Caro feared James's conscience more than he feared exposure. He saw James's intention to legally adopt William, to name him in a will as a threat, not to property, but to reputation. Caro had built his life on silence and control. He could not risk an heir he had hidden. Elliot placed the letter down gently. "So he killed him, and buried the truth beneath every stone he laid in this house." Holmes nodded once. "Until the voice on your voice, Mr. Godfrey, began to disturb the foundation." William rose and walked to the window, gazing out at the chapel wall in the distance. "It's strange," he said softly, "to be at the center of something you never asked to enter. I was the silence they feared, even as a child." Elliot stood beside him. "And now?" William turned. "Now I will carry no name but my own. I seek nothing from this house. But I will not be a secret any longer." Elliot held his gaze, then nodded. "You will always be welcome here." Holmes moved to the mantel, finally removing his gloves and placing them beside the fire. He said nothing, but I saw the faintest flicker of approval in his features. Not pride exactly, but the quiet satisfaction of a man who had pulled the last thread and found not only a truth, but a beginning. We took our leave shortly after. There were no dramatic farewells, no speeches, just a shared understanding between all present that something long broken had found its shape again, not through restoration, but through reckoning. As the carriage rattled away, I turned once to look back at the Grange. Its windows no longer seemed hollow. The great wall that had once whispered fear now stood quiet, not mute but finished. Holmes, seated opposite me, struck a match and lit a fresh cigarette. After a moment he said, "You see, Watson, the dead do not speak to haunt us. They speak to remind us that silence is a choice, and truth is not a matter of time but of courage." I nodded, struck as always by the rare poetry in his philosophy. He turned his face to the glass, watching the world blur into motion once more, and behind us, Abbott's Grange stood still at last, its final voice heard, its story closed.